Karl, I'm going to make you a panelist because I don't believe you brought any charts or anything to share. So that should give you at least, I should be able to hear you. Waiting to hear you.
Can you hear me?
Got you, Karl. How are you,
right,
buddy?
Oh, I'm doing fine. It's a beautiful morning. Well, at least a little bit anyway over here. I see you brought up one of my pages.
Yeah, I'm showing your website.
Yeah, that's a few articles back, but yes.
Okay. I was scrolling through it, and what I'm interested in, Karl, is how did you come to be a writer? Was it always your your desire or goal to be a political commentator, financial commentator? Why don't you tell us a little bit about your journey? I'll call this point B. Maybe you could give us the highlights of point A and how you got here.
Sure. Well, in the 1990s, I was the CEO of one of the original publicly available internet companies. Well, not publicly traded. We never did go through that nonsense. And in large part, that was because what I saw in the 1990s in the market was a bunch of scam corporations that never made any money and never were going to. So we decided to navigate that as a privately held firm instead. And I semi-retired in 1998, having sold the company to Winstar, which, if you remember, was one of the largest corporate bankruptcies in the history of the United States a couple of years later. So their check was good. That was the important part. And then in 2007, I started writing the market ticker because after the early spring crash in China, I don't know how many of your listeners and viewers remember this, but in the first couple of months of 2007, there was a enormous detonation that occurred in the Chinese marketplace overnight with what at the time appeared to be no explanation. There was nothing particularly going on, and it just all went in the handbasket at once. And so I started looking around saying, okay, as someone who at that point was a more or less a passive investor, I was trading my own account, but I didn't see it coming. And so when I dug around, what I found was a tremendous amount of excessive leverage in the banking system, and a lot of it was centered in the housing market and what I considered to be fraud. So I started writing on it. I said, look, I got out the last time with my hide intact. I'm going to get out this time too. But how many people got ruined because they had no warning the last time around? And the answer was a very large number of people that had their retirement income and everything else destroyed.
Yeah, that was the second time.
2000. Yeah, 2000 was the one that yeah.
Yeah, so that's why a lot of people after that said, you know what? If anyone's going to lose my money, it's going to be me. And we had a big wave in self-directed traders after that, when people found that even a diversified portfolio did not.
Yeah, it didn't help you very much, did it? So so basically what I started with was analyzing the bank and turned into the Federal Reserve System, because some of the first articles I wrote actually had to do with Washington Mutual, which was paying dividends with money they didn't actually have. That should have led to them being closed the day after they reported their first quarterly numbers for 2007. It didn't, of course. And a year and change later, they failed, exactly as you'd expect when you start trying to hand out money you don't got. Eventually you will run out. Your checking account balance will end up negative, and that's that was ultimately what ended up happening.
So was this project your way of spreading the word to help people not get caught up in things that could be damaging to their financial life?
Yeah, it was that, and it was also my way of giving something back, because I had certainly profited mightily from the internet craze, even though we didn't engage in any of the nuttiness. I was in the right place at the right time. And so, there was a lot of money that was made there running a company in that environment, of course. The question is, did I really owe anybody anything? And the answer is probably not, but I felt that it was the right thing to do.
You enjoy it too, don't you?
Sometimes. I mean, it's kind of funny because, over the last 10 years, there's now over 11,000 articles that have been published on the market ticker.
Wow.
Over the last 10 years.
Prolific. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's nobody else writing on this account either. I mean, everything that you see here is my work. It's not like some of these sites that pick up, 2 articles from this guy and 1 article from this guy, and they quote this, and all of this is my work. There's, of course, I excerpt other people's things if I'm making a point or making a commentary on something they've said. But in terms of who's actually doing this site, who's actually running the site, it's all mine and has been since the beginning.
Okay.
The problem here today is that we're 10 plus years into this. It's 2017 now, almost 2018, and despite all of this, we really haven't changed anything. If anything, the problem's gotten worse.
Okay, so now we're going to fast forward to where we are now, and I found it interesting when you and I exchanged a few DMs on Twitter. That you have an opinion on Bitcoin and crypto. So why don't we start there? You call it bit scam. Tell us why it's a scam, Karl.
Well, all existing cryptocurrencies that are in the market today, someone may eventually come up with one that doesn't have this characteristic, but all of them today give you the same reward for an ever-increasing amount of work. Okay, so if you think about the classic Ponzi scheme, Charles Ponzi and his postal reply coupons, that was the same deal. You got the same reward, same number of dollars for a ever-increasing amount of work. Why an ever-increasing amount of work? Because there's only a certain number of people, and it gets harder and harder to get the people to generate this traffic. Okay, well,
are you talking about like bit mining?
Well, yeah, the problem with mining is that it requires, because of the design of the system, the problem that you're trying to solve, the mathematical problem, becomes more difficult on an exponential basis the more coins are mined. And yet the reward that you get for mining a coin is a coin. Okay, so the reward's exactly the same, and yet the amount of effort that is required as time goes on goes up. So what this means is whoever comes up with one of these things, whether it be Bitcoin or Ethereum or Litecoin or whatever the next one is, whoever originates this gets a tremendous reward in percentage terms compared to everybody who follows. And not only that, but the value of his reward goes up as additional people do work, but he did nothing in order to obtain that additional value. So this is the classic definition of a Ponzi scheme, and I believe that if you actually, if you had governments that were to look at it in this sort of a context, this context, just analyze it mathematically, every one of these things would be considered felonious, and everyone involved would go to jail. Now, we don't live in a world where that happens in the United States, or for that matter, pretty much anywhere else anymore. But it's kind of amusing if you go back and look at the old Dragnet episodes. Remember the old television series in the 1960s? Sure. There's actually one of the episodes is this guy who's running what he's charged with is running a Ponzi scheme, and he gets into court, and the mathematician gets up in front of the board and points out exactly this same pattern, that everybody that you recruit to do this thing has to do more work, and yet they get the same reward. And he says, well, eventually you're going to run out of people who can do this, right? And there's the silence, and then and the verdict. Okay, so the problem is that all of these schemes are designed the same basic way. They all have different features. Everyone tries to come up with something that differentiates one from another, but at the end of the day, they all have this basic fundamental feature. And Bitcoin, of course, has a maximum number of coins, which most of these have. There is a terminus on this exponential problem, which leads to a number of other issues, because as things stand today,
that's a whole, one of the major theses besides anonymity, which we're seeing disappearing, that, people that own them are going to be audited for years now. I read an article about that.
Well, anonymity, well, look, anybody that believes that Bitcoin is anonymous in any way, shape, or form is on drugs. I want to know what they're smoking, because that's not even, I mean, some things may be legal in Colorado, but what these guys are using are not legal anywhere. The reality is the only way a cryptocurrency works is that every single transaction from the mining of a particular token forward must be able to be reconciled and proved by anyone at any point into the future. And since cryptographic math is admissible in court, every transaction is admissible in court. So the idea that you can somehow have anonymity in a world where every transaction is permanently auditable and carried around in public in the blockchain on a forever basis is laughable. The only reason that you have people saying this is because it's one of the attractions that people have for doing some of the things that they do with these currencies. And there's no anonymity there at all. None.
Okay. So while the mania continues, what do you think is going to be a tipping point to change the narrative to what you're talking about now? Does it come in after the fact, after prices have deflated? China made an attempt to make it illegal, really didn't have any impact on the market. What's it going to take for this mania to end?
Well, I'm not entirely sure. I mean, it's always easy in hindsight. You look at the housing bubble and the collapse, and it's obvious that what you were doing was issuing loans to people that had no money. And
rates started to go up to kind of pull the sheet off.
And in the 2000s, here's the interesting thing about the tech crash is that I can make a pretty clean argument that it was this little nothing company called MicroStrategy that announced an accounting irregularity that actually set the crash off. Now, MicroStrategy, by the way, is a firm that's still around. You can still look them up, MSTR. It's still a trading symbol. But there is a fairly clean argument to be made that this little know-nothing company that at the time was, from a market cap perspective, was inconsequential. It meant absolutely nothing. They literally caused the collapse of the NASDAQ, and it was simply a psychology shift. It always is. There wasn't anything special about MicroStrategy that made. I mean, it wasn't like that was Cisco, for example, which of course at the time was one of the high flyers. No, this was this little nothing company that announced that they were doing some kind of M&A transaction. Then a couple of weeks later, they come back and say, "Oh, by the way, we have an accounting problem." And next thing you know, everybody wakes up in the middle of the night and says, "Oh, well, gee, how much risk am I carrying on my book here?" and by the way, how many more of these companies are frauds? And the answer is too many. And then, of course, the selling starts. So I don't know what will set this off, but I think one of the bigger risk factors in the crypto world right now is a piece of news that came out a couple of weeks ago, but it's been totally ignored. And that is that the CoinDesk, which of course is one of the largest exchanges, has issued essentially 0 1099s to any of the people who have been trading through it in the United States. And eventually, Dr. Sugar is going to figure out that there's an awful lot of money there that people owe in taxes that has not been paid. And I suspect is, that could get kind of interesting because, you look at the Winklevoss twins that are now being touted as of last night as the first Bitcoin billionaires. Well, did they fork up their 39.6 on, that from 10 million to, I think it was 10 million they put in or something like that to $1 billion. That's a lot of money. And my guess is that the IRS would like their 39.6 on that. And if they didn't get it, well, there could be a problem. Okay.
So the fear of IRS audits, et cetera, people coming in thinking it was the misperception that they had anonymity.
Well, I think it's more than just the risk of audits. I think there's a possibility that you could have exchanges that failed to comply with the legal requirements to do business in the United States when it comes to tax reporting. I mean, I think it's a fairly clean argument that CoinDesk gets shut down.
The contract at the CME, people are going to get their 1099s. So.
Oh, absolutely, sure. At the CME, there's no question. I mean, they're not going to play that game. But,
right.
But what do you do with all the cash exchanges that are out there? And, and then there's always the possibility that you have something, you have a Mt. Gox writ large. People seem to forget that it isn't like this hasn't happened before, right? Where an exchange has just kind of disappeared along with all the money that was on deposit in it.
I see. Okay. Yeah, because they're not regulated. They're not clearing members of any exchange. They could just go away.
Yeah, well, what do you do with the the audit trails and things like this that are supposed to be there? I mean, I trade futures on occasion, and while the futures market is not perfect, at least one thing I'm reasonably sure of is that the money that's in my account at the end of the day is actually there.
Yes. So, and you're guaranteed by the exchange.
Well, at least in theory.
Even if the broker fails, if you're with a clearing member firm, you're guaranteed by the exchange.
In theory, we could talk about some of the things like Madoff and things like that where maybe that wasn't true, but at least in theory, yes, I am guaranteed by the exchange.
Yeah, I've never heard of a clearing member firm that customers were not made whole, and there were plenty of them. Stotler, RB&H. Refco.
Yeah, during the crash, after 2000, I had a trading account that got shuffled 3 or 4 different times from one place to another as people went under, and I never lost a penny.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, so why don't we shift gears to what's really on people's minds here after, and I read your piece here, so you're definitely, I would say, non-political, except that you think they're both, have a lot of shortcomings on both sides of the fence. So how do you think this is going to play out? We did get a pretty good market sell-off after the Flynn pleading guilty on Friday, but the market came right back after this, I guess you could call it tax reformation, tax package. Have you looked down the line, and do you have any kind of idea or opinion, I know that's all it could be from you, as to how this plays out as we go forward? Is there?
Yeah, I think we should take two. I think we should take two things and look at them as somewhat disjoint. Okay, and the first is this tax package, because that is legislation that is almost. I give that an 80% probability of being reconciled between in conference between the House and Senate, and something getting passed. There are a lot of problems with that package. The most serious from an American public perspective is that, contrary to all the assertions from the political people that are in support of it, it's not going to do anything whatsoever for the common American in terms of improving their purchasing power. In fact, it's going to do substantial harm to it by putting another $1 trillion and change on the deficit. And by the way, the CBO is always off on the low side. So if they're saying that it's going to add $1 trillion to the deficit over 10 years, it's going to be 2. And that's not because they're corrupt. It's because they don't get to choose how they analyze things. They have rules that they have to use in their analysis. And those rules are set by Congress, and those rules are designed to intentionally understate deficit impacts. That has always been true, and they have never missed on the high side, never once. So anytime that you get a number from the CBO that says that it will hurt the deficit by blah, double it and you're close. And so the impact there is going to be awful. The corporate impact, on the other hand, is a different situation entirely, because what you will get is substantially more fuel for buybacks and maybe some dividend activity. My guess is you're also going to get a fair amount of fuel for M&A activity, which is not positive for the consumer because it tends to enhance monopoly power. But it's certainly positive if you happen to be holding one of the companies that has that, that gets taken out at a 50% premium. So if you're the stockholder in a company that gets snatched.
So it's fuel for the stock market, but not for the economy.
Yeah, well, it is in the short term. Yes, I think the reaction that we've seen over the last, since Trump was elected, I think most of it has been on the back of the belief that this kind of a package would get passed. And so I think to a very large degree, this is priced in. Now, how much more mania you get with this, I don't know. But in terms of the actual impact on profits and on corporate activity, I think most of it is priced in, if not maybe overpriced at this point in time, simply because I don't think the package ends up being all that big. The large multinational corporation doesn't typically pay 20% now. Getting rid of some of the loopholes means that it's going to have very little impact on their balance sheets and their operating efficiencies. Where it will show up is in some of the smaller and mid-sized firms. So I like I said, I think it's oversold, okay, in terms of what people think they're going to get down the road. So that's the first aspect of this. The political aspect of it is, from my perspective, much more interesting and more dangerous, in that you've got a situation now where clearly there's been the let's use the long arm of the government to harass and damage the opposition, which is not a new tactic. Okay, it goes back a very long time. In fact, it's kind of been a feature of American politics since America existed. But it's sort of reached a pinnacle, if you will, with what's going on now and what was going on in the last few years of Obama's administration. It's just shifted focus from one side of the aisle to the other. But that doesn't change the fact that if you lie to the FBI, you're in a lot of trouble. And if you lie to the FBI and and then you compound that by doing things that can be construed as obstruction of justice, you can have really, really serious problems, including if you're the president of the United States. Now, contrary to many people's assertions, the FBI cannot indict a sitting president. Okay, so people need to sit down about that. What they can do, however, is issue a referral back to the House of Representatives, and that's essentially was the process that was going on when Nixon finally threw in the towel and said, "I'm done." That can happen, and of course, if Trump was to be impeached and removed, then they could indict him after he leaves office, which I have to assume wouldn't happen because Pence would pardon him.
Right.
So, but the problem with all of this is that what do presidents tend to do when these kinds of problems show up? Well, we can look at Bill Clinton. What Clinton did was start lobbing cruise missiles around.
I was afraid you were going to go there.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, history says that's where we go.
A president in wartime. Is that where you're going?
Well, I think there's given the provocations that exist now with North Korea, which are extremely serious. Anyone that does not take that threat seriously has rocks in their head, and we have a 30-plus year history of dealing very poorly with it. Okay, we have essentially got this idea in our head that we have the right to arbitrate as the United States, and maybe Russia as well, and a few other countries, who has the right to have nuclear weapons. Okay, well, this is a binary decision that we either have the ability to arbitrate this or we don't. And if we do, then we'd better do something about it, because these folks now have not only weapons, they also have missiles that can deliver them. Whether they can make the two of them work together is not proved, but I can't prove it is a terrible thing to rely on when being wrong means that you have a city that gets vaporized. And if we don't have the right to make that decision, then I hope you're ready for Iran and Venezuela, as just a couple of examples of countries that I'm quite sure we wouldn't like if they had them, to show up with these things in the very near future. So I am not at all comfortable with any of this. I just saw a report over the weekend that now you've got people in the military complex that are saying we got to get the dependents out of South Korea. And frankly, I think that should have been done a year ago.
You broke up a little bit. Who do they want to evacuate? The troops?
No, they want the dependents. They want all the families out.
Okay.
So basically, okay. I mean, right now, if you're in the military and you get posted over there, your family goes with you.
I see.
They want that to become an unaccompanied tour location, which is true for some of the other third world hellholes that we have troops in. But I think that's a decision that should have been made a couple of years ago, because this certainly is not something that just popped up out of the middle of nowhere. The North Koreans have been working on this technology for quite a long time. But I'm very concerned about the possibility that we either have to act on this, or we have to just admit that we're not going to do it, either with them or, for that matter, with anybody else. And my guess is that when under pressure, the option's going to be taken to blast this guy.
Okay, and you think the pressure could be the threat of losing power?
I think there's a legitimate reason to make the decision, and I think there's also the compounding pressure that is not quite so legitimate. The old wag the dog thing.
Okay, because a lot of our wars recently were about hegemony, right? Would you agree with me that any country, oil producer that wanted to get paid in anything else but U.S. dollars, coincidentally, there was a war there?
I think there's a pretty clean argument for it, but you also have to look at the other side of this too, which is we have in the past told people to give up their weapons of mass destruction. Gaddafi,
right,
of course, being the most recent, right?
Yeah.
And you saw what happened to him,
right?
After he said yes. That didn't work out so good. So
he's
for us,
not giving them up.
Yeah. So I mean, for Kim Jong-un, nut job though he quite clearly is, in my opinion, I'm sure he saw that and doesn't want to be the next guy up.
Can you put a percentage on it? How worried are you? You put a percentage on the tax bill. Where would you put this? 50?
I think, well, first off, I think if there's a higher percentage that we end up shooting back and forth by accident than by deliberate act.
I mean, like with the exercises that are going on there today?
Yeah, and, someone over there gets trigger happy and blasts one of our planes, and then things get really bad. I think there's a 50-50 chance within the next year or two that we have some sort of armed conflict. And the problem with us trying to take him out and essentially end this problem is that we have, and it's not an indictment of the United States, because these operations have a very high failure rate. I would be willing to bet that there's at least a 50% chance that if we do it, we miss. And then, if you're in South Korea, you're going to have a really bad day. How far that goes and whether or not he's crazy enough to use what he's got, I don't know. But, the damage to the South Korean economy, remember that a huge percentage of all electronics manufacturing at some phase goes through South Korea. So if Seoul gets attacked, whether they get nuked or whether it's just conventional, there's thousands of artillery pieces that are on essentially what amount to railroad tracks dug into the mountains just north of the DMZ. We cannot get them before they rain tens of thousands of shells down upon South Korea. That's just fact. The damage to the global economy, especially in the high-tech area, that would come from such an event would be, I can't even put a number on it. But it's going to be everywhere. It's not just the United States. It's going to be worldwide.
Right. Okay, so they'll probably shut the markets down for a week, something like that.
Well, I don't know if they'd shut the market down, but I'm quite sure that you're not going to like the direction of the arrow.
Okay. Anything you want to wrap it with today, Karl?
No, I don't think so. The only thing I would add is that if you really want to look at where the problems are within the U.S. economy and what's driving the issue, it's the scam in healthcare. If we do not solve that as a nation within the next several years, and I am, a few years ago I said end of Trump's first term. I'm still pretty much on that timeline. We could be off a couple of years one way or another, but I first put this timeline out back in the 1990s. So if you're off by 2 or 3 years over 30, you're not doing so bad, right?
So you mean if we don't solve it, that there's a price to pay?
The economy will fold back and collapse, and so will the markets.
Okay. So you think that could be the trigger, since what is it 1/3 of our economy, healthcare?
It's approximately 20% of GDP.
Oh, 20%.
Today,
Okay.
and it needs to be 4.
Okay.
So yeah, that's a huge problem. The problem is that if you actually fix it, you get a recession unlike anything we've had since the 1930s.
And how do you fix it? Quickly.
You start locking people up for violating 100-plus-year-old law that does apply to them. It's 15 United States Code Chapter 1. So Sherman, Clayton, and Robinson-Patman Acts. The health industry twice has tried to go to the Supreme Court to get declared that they're immune from this. They lost both cases. That was in the late 1970s and 1980s. There has not been one attorney general that has brought a case related to this since, and that's insane.
Okay, is that a monopoly law?
Yeah, that's Sherman, Clayton, and Robinson-Patman are antitrust laws. Yeah.
Okay, so, and what happened over the weekend with, who was it? HealthNet?
And CVS.
Yeah. That
Yeah,
just
you're just adding to, you're just adding to it. You're adding to the problem. So.
Yeah. All right. Well, I tell you what, I really appreciate meeting you and getting your view. And there was a very interesting explanation about some of the pitfalls in crypto. And just like you, I pray that peace reigns. And thank you for making our community aware of some things on a macro level that affect our lives more than being in a good trade and making 50 pips in the euro currency. And I do have one point. I'm going to mentor you. You call yourself irredeemable, Karl?
Yes.
I believe anything that you call yourself or say about yourself, you become. And I disagree because I don't think anyone's irredeemable. And after talking to you for half an hour, either are you, buddy.
Well, I took that off the deplorable and irredeemable thing from the campaign. That's where that came from. So
yeah, you've been redeemed, and it's very, it was very real nice meeting you, Karl. And Karl's a great follow. You could follow him at Ticker Guy, and I follow you even though you don't follow me. And people could go to your website here. Any other place they could see your writings or your views? This is the main.
Yeah, market-ticker.org that's pretty much where I write. So you'll find my stuff.
Okay. All right. Well, Merry Christmas, buddy, and Happy New Year.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me on.
You're very welcome, Karl. Okay, F.A.C.E, that's it for today. See everyone tomorrow for Turnaround Tuesday. Glad you enjoyed it, Tom. Kevin, glad you liked it. And we'll be seeing you tomorrow morning. Maybe there'll be some nice reversal trades to take tomorrow. And most of all, guys, don't just count your pips, count your blessings. See you tomorrow, guys and gals. Thank you, Karl.
Thank you.